This video focuses on section/question 4 about issues of human rights. It was the first video, and I'm going to cover prejudice, racism, and equality. Now, when it comes to equality, we're going to talk about, obviously, racism, as I said, sexism, ableism, and religious discrimination. So, let's get into this pretty straightforward topic. Now, when it comes to prejudice, okay, guess what? The Catholic Church are not okay with it, all right? Now, the key thing here is to remember Jesus' teachings about love and that big bad boy quote from the Catechism, all right, where it says, every form of social or cultural discrimination on the grounds of sex, race, colour, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. Wow, that's a lot to remember. You're right. So let's summarize it down. Every form of discrimination must be curbed as incompatible with God's design. Right, so you could be asked to describe the different types of prejudice in the world. Easy peasy. Racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, religious discrimination, homophobia, etc., etc. Okay? If because it was described, just name them, tell me what they are. Okay? As in sexism, discrimination based on someone's sex/gender. Now, explain Catholic views on discrimination. Oh, come on, right? This is simple and easy. Everyone should be treated equally. Why? We're all made in God's image and likeness. What they think, all types of discrimination should not exist. Why? Back to that quote. Every form of discrimination must be curbed as incompatible with God's design. Next one is Catholics believe that we should support victims of discrimination. Why? Because Jesus bounced his gums about it when it came to the parable of the sheep and the goats and the Good Samaritan. Next one. Catholics aim to raise, or promote the status of groups that are discriminated against to educate others about them. All right? So you can say about things like, the reason why I do this is that love thy neighbour, but also, this is a better teaching to use, that there are many rooms in my Father's house. So we can say with that is the fact that everyone's included, okay? Whether it be different religion, different whatever, okay? That Catholics should prioritise helping those who are victims of discrimination, particularly the poor, okay? Now, why is this? Because of, there's lots of different teachings, okay? Again, the parables that I spoke about a second ago. But if you want to say about the Catechism and the modern church teaches about preferential option for the poor, that would just make your answer. Now, when it comes to, right, the sort of, the alternative to this or that sort of thing, right? When it comes to the alternative about it, right, about whether issues with prejudice can be overcome, right? That what you can say in your alternative is that there's only so much that we can do as individuals. So let me rephrase that. So if you ask the question something like, all Catholics should fight against discrimination. Okay? Now, if that is why, you would say the reasons I've just given beforehand. But the alternative, reasons why they shouldn't, well, you could say, well, they're only individuals, there's only so much we can do by ourselves to actually stop any sort of discrimination. Number two, there's only so much that the church can do, okay? There's only limited power that the church has, all right? Governments are the ones that need to make a difference. You could say about the fact that it places us in danger. I mean, this isn't the revision guide, but it might do. If you stand up for somebody who's been discriminated against, then you could be putting yourself in harm. Financial issues helping those most in need, okay? So countries or even individuals may not be able to afford to sort of support charities that help those being discriminated against, etc. Sometimes the church's stance on some issues, such as sexism and homophobia, undermines their support, okay? So what I mean by that, right, and this is a sort of a really strong answer if you can articulate it well, is that, okay, we're supposed to be against sexism, but then we don't allow women to be priests. Obviously, we know all the teachings and all sorts of stuff and the reasons that go with that, but it just gives you an idea, doesn't it, okay, that you could say that, well, you're saying that all of us are equal, but then you are not treating men and women equal, okay? There's an argument to make there. So that deals with prejudice. Now, you could be asked specifically about racism and equality, and the four topics you could be asked about, right, are racism, sexism, ableism, and religious discrimination. Now, what I have done here intentionally is that I have come up with sort of 5 points that you can use across all of them, okay? And supported them with the teachings, right? It's the therefore, the specific examples, that's where there's difference, okay? Now, when it comes to sort of defending others or making change or any of that sort of thing, right? That it needs to start at the top. So So if you get asked to explain how Catholics fight against racism, sexism, ableism, or religious discrimination, you start at the top. Catholics do this by the Pope speaking out, the leader, the boss. He needs to get everyone on board, okay? Why? Because he does. He needs to model it for us. Now, when it comes to racism, you can say about that the Pope has done this on several occasions, all right? That he has spoken out, whether it be through papal letters or whether it comes from just doing sort of like through his preaching, okay, that feelings of hatred towards groups judged for their ethnic, national, or religious identity has risen, and we are all called to stop this. I mean, you can say, therefore, the Pope has spoken about the fact that we are all called to fight against prejudice. That's what I would be using from the quotation. All right. If it is religious discrimination, okay, then you say the same thing for the therefore, but you can also say about the fact that the Pope is part of the Interfaith Council, okay, meets with other religious leaders, okay, to formulate a collective plan. Now, the second thing, so if the Pope's on board, he's modelled it, he's taught us about it, what comes next? All Catholics need to promote equality. Why? Because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. So, therefore, how can Catholics do this when it comes to the groups who are discriminated against? Easy. They lead an inclusive life, okay? They model it to others. They stand up against people when they are victims of prejudice. They support. You get my drift, right? That's really sort of straightforward, therefore. Then, when it comes to the next 2 points, okay, that you need to mention about the fact that Catholics need to do stuff before it happens, so are proactive, and then the point after that, so your fourth point is that they need to be reactive when prejudice occurs, okay, or discrimination occurs. So, let's start off with when they are being proactive. So, Catholics need to be proactive, all right, when they help. And the reason for that is that quotation from before. The fact that all types of discrimination must be curbed as they're incompatible with God's design. All right, so how can they be proactive? Well, they can hold community cohesion events. They can have fetes. They can have public speakers, street campaigners, right? And what I mean by that is, sort of like, you know, the ones that are in sort of town and they're handing out leaflets and that type of thing. That sort of idea, all right? That they could do it that way, all right? They could also do fundraisers together, that type of idea, all right? And all that sort of stuff, right, is that if people see the church with people of different races, different sexes, if they have any disabilities, even with different religions, all working together, then that is a model for others to see and go, this is what normality should be like. So they're doing this in the hope that it impacts on other members of society, so that idea of inclusion filters out. Now, what about the next point about the fact that what they do when it comes to supporting victims of abuse? Well, the reason they do this is to love thy neighbour and the parables I've mentioned before. Okay, goat and sheep, good Samaritan. So, what can they do to support victims of prejudice once it's happened? Well, number one, they can just be there for them. But they could also campaign for laws to change, to become stronger. They could sign petitions where sort of this type of prejudices that happen and send them to the government, because they're the ones who are going to make the true sort of change and difference. When it comes to religious discrimination, you could hear for this one, you could say that they could be proactive about it by supporting one another, but also by holding shared worship events, doing such as a multi-faith service. All right. So what I mean by that is that people of all different faiths, so ever come together, having a service. So it wouldn't be a mass, all right, but it'd be a service, and it could be like at this point that you pray, for those in need, or in which way you choose to, and regardless of what faith you were part of, you could all fulfill that. Next one. And final one. Catholics need to support groups / people that are dedicated to making a difference. Okay, why? For all those same teachings as before. Okay, love thy neighbour, or made the image and likeness of God, all that sort of stuff. Right? Just use one that you haven't used in the answer yet. Okay. The reason that they need to do this is that we're all busy people. We've all got demands in our lives, that sort of thing, right? And there are some sort of groups, organisations that are dedicated to helping those who are victims of prejudice that the Catholic Church can support, whether it be sort of monetary or whether a Catholics actually join these groups as a volunteer or whatever. So when it comes to victims of racism, you could talk about show racism the red card. Okay, that would be one. When it comes to sexism, you could say about Christian Aid. It was called with victims of Christian Aid, and also you can talk about the charity This Girl Can. The next one, when it comes to ableism, okay, you can talk about the fact that they can help people who have mental health issues. So whether it be, you can talk about Mind, or you could talk about the charity Scope, okay, and you also talk about the Catholic Mental Health Project. So that's all to do with ableism. When it comes to religious discrimination, well, it's not really a group to support, okay, like an organisation, but instead, right, it's more, it's very much their responsibility. So what they can do is that you could support, Catholics should support politicians, all right, who recognise the importance of faith, because they're the ones who are going to make the difference, if you want, for people who are religious believers who are being discriminated against, who are going to have laws in place to make sure that they don't get discriminated against sort of going forward, all right? And they themselves can contribute to the Interfaith Council of Wales, okay? So you could talk about that. If you could bring down your answer, that would be amazing. So that is sort of prejudice and racism and equality all in one.